This is my son. The first time we met, he was no bigger than a raisin. Yet today, he has a full body, functioning organs, a nervous system, and consciousness. So the question we're going to answer in this Psych Explained video is, how does a single cell turn into a human life? Alright guys, welcome to Psych Explained. In this video, we're going to talk about the amazing 9-month journey of life, or more specifically, the 3 stages of prenatal development. Now, before we get to the stages, what I want to first cover are the major structures and cells that make life possible in the first place. And we're going to start with this diagram here. It's probably something you've seen 1,000 times online in textbooks, and this is the female reproductive system. So let's just make sure we are understanding what we are looking at. So a couple structures I do want to point out. The bottom structure right here is what we're going to label as the vagina, and this would be the birth canal, right? Sitting right above it is what we call the cervix, okay? When a woman is about to give birth and doctors say she's 3 centimeters dilated, 5 centimeters dilated, what they're referring to is the opening of the cervix, which remains closed during pregnancy. And then we have this entire body, that's the womb, that's going to house the entire embryo, is what we call the uterus, right? Or the womb, the uterus, okay? There we go. So the vagina, the cervix, and the uterus. Now, other really important structures. We have this structure right here. We're going to zoom in a second. This would be the fallopian tubes, okay, or the uterine tubes. And what houses all of the eggs that have potential to become a human being in an area called the ovary. And this would be the female gonads, while the testes would be the male gonads. So we have the vagina, cervix, uterus, fallopian tubes, and ovaries. And what we're looking at here is a zoomed in version of this cross section. So we have the uterus or womb, this would be the uterine cavity, the wall or lining of the uterus, the fallopian tube, we'll talk about the purpose of that, and we have the ovary sitting right here. So those are the major structures. Now, what about the major cells or reproductive cells that are vital to create life in the first place? And that's what we have right over here, and we'll talk about why it's sitting over here in a moment. Now, there are 2 main reproductive sex cells needed to create life. Now, what's important to know is that these structures together have a name. Do we know the name? Any reproductive sex cells is something that we call gametes, okay? Gametes. And they are different depending on if you are male or female. So, for example, the male gamete would be what we call a sperm cell, and in the female, this would be called an egg, okay, or ovum. Put that in parentheses. All right, so that's the gametes that are going to be needed to create life. Now, what's really important to know, we'll talk about this later on as well, is that within each gamete is a nucleus. So we have one nucleus inside the eggs, and we have one sitting inside the sperm cell. Now, why is that important? Because within inside the nucleus is all the genetic material that's going to make you. Determine the color of your skin, the texture of your hair, how tall you might be, your weight, predisposition to diseases. So this is going to contain all of our genetic material. Now, what structure houses that genetic material? We call that chromosomes, right? Now you might be thinking, is there 46? Well, not in gametes. In gametes, they only have 1 pair because they haven't fused together. So instead, we have 23 chromosomes in the sperm cell, and we have 23 chromosomes in the nucleus of the egg cell. Okay, so that's just important to know, and we'll come back to that later on. All right, so there we go. We have our major structures, and we have our reproductive cells to create life. All right, so let's start with the first stage of prenatal development. We're going to come over here. The first stage that we need to know, and this is where it's really going to start, and this is considered, well, I'll get to the dates in a moment, is called the germinal stage. Say it with me, what is it called? The germinal stage. And how are we going to remember it's called the germinal stage? Well, everything at this moment is pretty microscopic. It's almost the size of a germ, right? That's a really nice memory technique. And in terms of dates, this is considered pretty much the first 2 weeks after fertilization. And we'll talk about what fertilization means as well. So let's say day 0 to day 14, right? The first 2 weeks of life. Okay, so what is actually happening? Now, we're going to talk about this in a moment, which is the fact that we're going to think about the germinal stage as a sequence of events. And we'll talk about what the first stage is. But let's start over here, okay? Now, in order to actually have life, you have to have an egg. Okay, so where are the eggs stored? Well, the eggs are stored, and we'll come back over here, in this structure right here called the ovary. And I've already mentioned this is just kind of a zoomed in version of the ovary, okay? And you have all these little tiny eggs, okay? Now, at the moment, they're not actually mature eggs, okay? They're like teenagers. They're not, right? They got some issues. They need some time to become an adult. In fact, an immature egg is what we call an oocyte. What's it called? An oocyte. So we have tons or hundreds of thousands of oocytes within the ovary. Now, how are we going to get the ovary out of the ovary, or the oocyte out of the ovary to get ready to be fertilized? Well, it begins with what we call the menstrual cycle, okay? The phrase menstrual cycle basically means the body of a woman is preparing itself to get pregnant. So what happens? Well, one thing that happens during a menstrual cycle is the thickening of the uterine wall. So the uterine wall actually gets thicker. Why is that? So when the egg comes out of the fallopian tubes, okay, all here, it's going to embed itself in the uterine wall. It's kind of like a cushioning. Okay, so that's kind of one part of the menstrual cycle. The other part is what we call, and we'll write this in a different color, is what we call ovulation. Ovulation, okay? So what is ovulation? Ovulation is the release of an egg, okay? So eventually these oocytes have to pop out into the fallopian tube. Well, how's that going to happen? Well, the first thing that's going to happen is this ovary is going to release a lot of hormones. Can you think of any hormones that might be released by the ovary? Well, if you're thinking estrogen or progesterone is another one, you're correct. Estrogen. Okay, so we have a kind of a surge in estrogen. Now, we cannot talk about anything in the body without talking about the brain. So here's what we have. The ovary is going to communicate to the brain. How's this going to work? Well, let's draw it here. As the estrogen floods our blood, okay, this information, and I'll move it over here, is going to head up to the brain. Okay, now, what part of the brain would this go to? All right, let's think about all of our biology knowledge. What part of the brain controls the entire endocrine system, right? It's the executive command center that kind of regulates the hormones in the body. Well, if you're thinking, I think that's the hypothalamus, you are correct. Hypothalamus, okay? Let's do something like this. Hypothalamus, okay? And the hypothalamus is going to trigger another gland. We call this the master gland. This is the pituitary gland, okay? That kind of sits right below it, okay? So hypothalamus is going to talk to the pituitary gland. And what this is going to do, I'll just write PG, pituitary gland right here, is it's going to release tons of hormones into the blood in reaction to the ovary, right? The ovary is communicating with the brain, and then the brain's going to communicate back. And it's going to release a lot of different hormones that are going to make its way back to the ovary. Now, this is more technical than we need to know, but things like, follicle stimulating hormone or luteinizing hormone. And the reason it's called follicle stimulating hormone is because all these oocytes are surrounded by follicles. Okay? It's like the house for the egg or house for the oocyte. Okay, those are follicles. Okay? Once this information gets back to the ovary, okay, as we kind of have this, feedback loop, what's going to happen? Boop! This egg is going to pop out. Okay? And there we go. We have the egg, and what are we missing? The nucleus, right? The 23 chromosomes. We have the nucleus, okay? This is essentially ovulation, right? This is part of the menstrual cycle. And what's going to happen is this egg, okay, is going to start moving down the fallopian tube, okay? And by the way, these hands little here, these are called fimbriae. They kind of grab the egg, and then there's kind of little, like hair cells down here. that are kind of grabbing and pushing the egg. It's very philosophical. I just imagine like hands taking the egg, ready to, you know, be fertilized for birth. It's a very philosophical kind of moment here. But here we go. We have the egg going up here. And we'll actually have the egg continue to travel to about right here. Now, what has to happen? Well, the egg has to have another gamete, a male gamete, to become a human being. So what do we have? We need sperm cells. Okay, so let's have our sperm cells down here. Upon ejaculation, and here's my sperm cells, okay, and of course, what do we need? We need our little nucleus. This is very important, okay? Around 200 to 300 million sperm cells are released at one point. I want you to think about that, 200 to 300 million, but only one is going to fertilize this egg. Which begs the question, if it was a different sperm cell, would you be you? Would you have the same consciousness? Or would you be an entire different person, right? Those are the questions I want you to be thinking about. And these sperm cells are going to be making up their way up the vagina, through the cervix opening, to the uterine cavity, right? And they're going to make their way. Now, some are going to die, some are going to get lost, right? Some are going to go to the wrong fallopian tube and like, where am I? You're in the wrong fallopian tube. But the sperm cells that go are going to make their way down the fallopian tube. And there's one, just one, that is going to touch the egg, okay? It's going to touch the egg. It's going to release specific enzymes. And what is it going to do? It's going to penetrate or burrow itself into the egg, okay? And what's going to happen is it's going to release its nucleus into the oocyte, okay, into the egg. The moment that happens, these two nuclei are going to fuse together, okay? How cool is that? The moment this occurs, what would happen? This is called, we'll write over here together, this is the beginning of our journey. This is called fertilization. Fertilization, okay? So fertilization is the union or mixing together of a sperm cell, an egg cell, and our two nuclei. Now remember our chromosomes. We have 23 and 23. Now what do you think we have? If you're thinking 46, you are correct, okay? So we now have 46 chromosomes. Now this egg is still going to continue down this track, right? It's almost like the sperm go this way and then the egg's going this way. And by day one, and we'll write this in two, by day one, we now have essentially a new human being, okay? With DNA from the mom, maternal, and DNA from the dad, paternal. And this single cell, do you know what this cell is called? This is called a zygote, okay? A zygote. And this is going to be kind of next on our list of sequences. We go from ovulation to fertilization. We've created a zygote, okay, right here. And this zygote is going to continue on the journey. Now, what's important to know also, I think this is just kind of interesting, is this egg really had two destinies. It either A, is going to continue to remain unfertilized and just go down the fallopian tube and bypass the, the uterine wall and just come out through a menstrual cycle. That's called a menstrual period, right? Along with the uterine lining. That's what a period is. The other destiny is fertilization, right? So those are the two destinies of this. Now, what happens after we have a zygote? What we're going to have is rapid cell division. This zygote is going to replicate itself over and over and over and over again, right? So we have fertilization zygote, and then we are going to have cellular division. Now, another name for cellular division, at least in this process, is what we call cleavage. Okay, so cleavage is when we have the replicating of these cells. So what would that look like? Well, we have one cell, which by day two, I'll need a bigger egg here. Now, it's not an oocyte anymore. It's actually an ovum. It's an egg. Is going to start dividing in two. And now we have two nuclei, right? So this would be the two-cell stage. What do we have after that? After that, we're going to turn into 4. Okay? Remember, this oocyte, this egg is continue moving this way. And then we go to, well, just keep adding it, right? Now we go to the 8-cell stage. And I'll see if I can get some sort of, 8 cells. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I'll do 7, 8. There we go. There's my weird 8-cell stage. 8-cell, okay? And then we'll go to the 16-cell stage. And I know I'm not going to have exactly 16, but you get the point, right? 16. Now at this point, this is actually called the morula. Okay, I could actually write that in, the morula, and it's named after that it looks like a berry, right, like a raspberry. And this is kind of a clump of cells, okay, a clump of cells. Now what's really important to know is this structure is the same size as the original zygote. It's not a giant structure. It's just that the cells are just really compact, all right? So that's really important to know. This is not bigger, it's just, clumped together, okay? All right, now here's what's important. The last big structure to evolve after the morula, right before implantation, okay, and this is going to be tons of cells, is what we call, and I'll write it right above it as well, is called the blastocyst. Blastocyst, okay? And what's amazing about the blastocyst is that it's actually hollow. There's nothing on the inside except for fluid on one side and a couple cells on the other side. So we can actually draw that together, right? All the cells are on the outside. Now, you can get very technical. You can watch, hours of YouTube videos just on the morula, just on the blastocyst. We're not going to get that technical, but there is a name for the outside cells, okay? And you have a little clump of cells on the side, right here, okay? And the reason that's important, at least the blastocyst is important, is because the cells are starting to differentiate, right? Everything has a purpose. The outer cells are going to develop into something. We'll talk about that in a moment. And the inner cells are about to develop into something, okay? So actually write that in right over here. The blastocyst is going to be one of our major structures. Blastocyst. And then finally, what do we have? We have implantation, okay? This big blastocyst is going to embed itself into the uterine wall, okay? And also, you can watch hours and hours and read tons and tons just on implantation, but we're not going to get that technical, okay? So it's going to implant itself there a little after a week, and it's going to be there hopefully for 9 months. Okay, so there we go. Let's recap. Oh, by the way, let's write implantation down here. That's our last stage. Implantation. So here's what I was meaning by the germinal stage. Think about it like a sequence of events. We start with ovulation, the release of an egg. We have fertilization, the fusion of our 2 gametes. We create a single cell called a zygote. We have rapid cell division or cleavage. We create a blastocyst. And finally, that blastocyst implants itself into the uterine wall. All right, so there's our first stage. Let's talk about stage number 2. Stage number 2, which is a big stage, is what we call the embryonic stage. Embryonic stage, okay? Or embryogenesis is like whatever happens during that stage. Instead of the first 2 weeks, this stage is considered week 2 to about week 8, okay? Now, the embryonic stage is really important. If you take a look at all the structures here, it starts to actually resemble a human being. We have little buds, little arm buds, and we have leg buds. Eventually, and this is going to look like an alien, you'll actually have an eye, right? You'll actually see, it won't be open, you'll have an eye. So you start creating real life. Now, to come back to the embryonic stage, I want to come back to the blastocyst. Let's actually draw that together. And I'll draw it almost identical to what we had, right? We have cells on the outside. Eventually, this outside membrane is going to, detach itself, okay? We have the cells on the inside on one corner. All right, now the reason this is important is because during this stage, things are going to change. Everything has a purpose. What we find is that the outer cells, and we call this the outer cell mass, is going to develop into what we call the placenta, right? Everything's differentiated. Everything has a purpose now, okay? We'll talk about the placenta in a moment. And what do you think about the inner cells? Well, the inner cells, the green, are going to develop, well, instead of outer cell mass, this is the inner cell mass. Inner cell mass is going to develop into the actual embryo with a head and a body. This is going to become the baby, the embryo. Okay, so that's why this is really important. The cells start to differentiate. Now, what is the placenta? Just very quickly, the placenta is down here, okay? I'll actually label it. It's this structure right here, the placenta. And what the placenta is it's an organ. And it helps nourish the baby. It gives nutrients and oxygen to the growing embryo and also removes waste from the embryo's blood. It's essentially the lifeline between the mom and the baby. So whatever the mom consumes, so does the baby through the umbilical cord, right? Attached to the belly button. And that's how the baby receives nutrients or removes waste. So mothers, remember, whatever you eat, so does the baby. Whatever you drink, so does the baby. Okay, there's the placenta and the umbilical cord. All right, so what happens next? Well, what we're going to write, I think I'll use this marker, is the actual development of the baby. I mean, we have so much information right here. So what we're going to refer to, instead of cell division, right, instead of cellular division, what we're going to have is cell differentiation. Differentiation. Okay, I'll use red. So division and differentiation, which means that all these cells now have a purpose and they're going to develop into something. What are they going to develop into? Well, we're going to start having all of the systems of the body develop, everything you need to live and be a human being. So we have things like, the nervous system is going to develop. Now, not entirely, right? It's actually a neural tube. We don't actually have a functioning brain, but the cells that will create a nervous system will be there. The urinary system, the bladder, right? The urinary system. And by the way, as I'm writing this, just start thinking about other systems that I'm going to write down, right? We have the circulatory system, right? Heart system. Okay. What else do we need? We need to breathe, right? So we have the respiratory system. Respiratory system, and maybe just one more, right? There's many of them, the digestive system. Right, so the majority, almost everything that a baby needs to live, from heart, lungs, kidneys, gonads, is going to, well, gonads a little later, is going to start creating during the embryonic stage. Now, you'll notice I have a little graph down here, okay? Why is this important? Well, because so many things are developing during the embryonic stage, it is most vulnerable and susceptible to bad things. So what do I mean by that? Well, this little asterisk right here is what I was going to write down, something called teratogens. Okay, what is a teratogen? A teratogen is any substance a mom consumes that could, or exposed to, that could affect the growing embryo. So it could be alcohol. It could be nicotine, it could be radiation, it could be mercury, anything that they should not be exposed to that can cause birth defects, language delay, intellectual disabilities, all of those things right there. We can even look at it on a graph what this would look like. So we have stage 1, 2, 3, right? This is the germinal stage and the embryonic stage. And this is the risk, right? The risk of something bad happening to the embryo or baby, growing baby. And if we take a look at this graph, I'll use this marker. What you can see, something like this, is that the greatest risk is during stage 2, the embryonic stage, right? All of this are things that could happen because of all the systems that are developing, okay? So make sure, mothers, that we take care of ourselves, especially during weeks 2 to 8. Now, this is not to say that, in week 27, you can just start smoking cigarettes. That's not what I'm saying. But the baby's less likely to be impacted than during this stage. Okay, so here's the embryonic stage. And we'll come back to teratogens at the end, and we come back to factors influencing development. All right, what is the last stage? We go to germinal, embryonic, and finally, we have the fetus, the fetal stage. Okay, the fetal stage. And as you see, we have a lovely, full baby. And this is considered the kind of final stages. So we'll say week 9 to about 38. 38 weeks to 40 is considered a full-term baby. Now, at this point, everything is pretty much developed, right? It just needs a little more time in the oven, right, so to speak. So what we're really referring to is the kind of the final, the final growth and development. Okay, And this could be, right, we have the brain. So if we look up here, during the fetal stage, we're going to start having, right, our brain. And we'll have our spinal cord develop. It's no longer a neural tube, but it's actually a spinal cord. The kidneys are going to start to function. The liver, right? All of the things, the organs, everything we need to live outside of the womb is going to finally complete. Whether it's something like the gonads, right? The female, male genitalia, that's about week 13, 14 on an ultrasound. You can see whether you're having a boy or a girl. Now, other things that might develop during this stage is human features. In other words, the things that make us look human, right? Besides just a final growth and development, like skin is going to develop, and hair, okay, and nails, right? So everything that's going to make us look human is going to develop as well. And the final thing I'm going to write down is the baby is actually very active. We don't see this in the other stages. So we have activity and coordinated reflexes. So the baby might have a grasping reflex. They might suck their thumb. They're going to kick. They can hear the mom's voice or hear the outside world, so they start responding to environmental stimuli. The baby is ready for the outside world. Now, before we finish, it's important to know what are the factors that are going to influence this whole process. Now, you'll notice I divide into nature and nurture. Do we remember what the difference is? All right. Nature is anything genetic, right, inherited, and nurture represents things in the environment. So let's start with teratogens. Where do you think teratogens would go on the spectrum of nature-nurture? If you're thinking maybe around here, you would be right? Teratogens are from the environment. Teratogens, okay? As I said before, alcohol, nicotine, those type of things, right? If somebody drinks too much alcohol, that can cause fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS. That can cause intellectual disabilities. We also have things like the health of the mother, right? Obesity, diabetes, those things can affect, and even things like stress, right? Maternal stress can have a big impact on the baby, right? These are things from the environment. So what would go on the nature side? Well, there could be genetic abnormalities, right? Things that are passed down from the mother or father. Things like Huntington's disease or sickle cell anemia, right? These are things that are part of the genetic code, or issues with the chromosomes. Like Down syndrome, which is an extra chromosome on the 21st pair or partial chromosome, or Klinefelter syndrome. So you do have genetic and chromosomal as well. Now, we used to say in psychology, nature versus nurture. We don't say that anymore. We say nature and nurture. Okay, nature and nurture. Why? Because these can influence one another. There's a great term in psychology that's starting to get a lot of publicity that's called epigenetics. Okay, what this means is that whatever you're exposed to in your environment can have an effect on gene expression, right? So if you grow up in a really healthy environment, you might have a gene for a mental illness, but it's not going to show because you grow up in a good environment. But if you grow up in poverty or an impoverished environment, that gene might express itself and then you develop a mental illness. So epigenetics is explaining the idea that there is a connection between nature and nurture. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I really hoped you learned about the journey of life. It is truly amazing, and it's still shocking to me how a single cell turns into a human being. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe. See you next time.